August 6, 1945. The sky over western Honshu was clear in the early hours, the kind of pale summer morning Japanese pilots had learned to read instinctively. Visibility stretched far beyond the coastline. No storms, no heavy cloud, nothing that suggested danger from above. At airfields across the region, routine watches were maintained. Radar screens remained quiet. There was no incoming mass formation. No warning that matched the patterns of the long war in the air. Shortly after 8:15 a.m., a single disturbance appeared over Hiroshima, not the rolling thunder of incendiaries, not the staggered rhythm of a bombing stream. What followed was silence, then a rising column that did not behave like smoke. It climbed too fast. It spread too evenly. From distant altitudes, pilots and observers saw the city disappear beneath a swelling canopy of ash and light, its shape erased in moments. Minutes later, reconnaissance aircraft were ordered toward the area. As they approached, instruments faltered, air currents twisted unpredictably. Below them, Hiroshima no longer looked like a city struck by war. It looked like a place removed. In those minutes, Japanese pilots began to understand that this was not an attack they had failed to stop. It was something air defense no longer applied to. By the summer of 1945, Japanese military aviation was no longer fighting for advantage. It was fighting to exist. The air war over the home islands had reached a stage where outcomes were no longer shaped by skill, courage, or even numbers, but by endurance, and Japan's ability to endure had been hollowed out over years of attrition. The experienced pilots who had once defined Japanese air power were largely gone. From the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942 through the grinding campaigns over Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and New Guinea, losses had accumulated faster than replacements could be trained. By 1944, accelerated flight programs produced aviators with a fraction of the hours once considered minimal. Fuel shortages further reduced training time. Many pilots reached combat having barely mastered basic formation flying, let alone interception at altitude. Against them stood the United States Army Air Forces, now operating with industrial depth Japan could not match. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the final imbalance. Flying higher, farther, and faster than earlier bombers, it operated above the effective ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. Even when fighters could reach those altitudes, climb time consumed precious fuel, leaving little margin for combat. Mechanical failures became as dangerous as enemy fire. Japan's air defense system struggled under these conditions. Radar coverage was incomplete and vulnerable to jamming. Communication between detection stations and interceptor units was slow and often disrupted. Coordination between Army and Navy air services, never seamless, degraded further as resources tightened. By early 1945, the system functioned less as an integrated shield and more as a series of isolated reactions. The shift in American bombing strategy accelerated the sense of helplessness. Beginning in March 1945, low-altitude incendiary raids devastated Japanese cities. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller urban centers burned with a thoroughness that made defense almost symbolic. Fighters that rose to meet the bombers were swarmed by escorts or scattered by altitude changes. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky but rarely achieved decisive results. Within Japanese aviation circles, the conclusion was grim but clear. Conventional defense could not stop the destruction. Yet within that recognition, a fragile belief persisted. Cities might burn, but the process still followed known rules. Bombers came in formations. Fires spread outward. Damage, however severe, unfolded across hours, not seconds. This belief shaped remaining strategy. Interceptions focused on disrupting bombing streams where possible. Civil defense planning assumed fires, not annihilation. Reconnaissance doctrine emphasized assessing damage patterns to determine rebuilding priorities and future defenses. Even kamikaze operations, desperate as they were, rested on the assumption that aircraft could still influence outcomes through sacrifice. Hiroshima, until August 1945, existed largely outside this cycle of destruction. As a regional military headquarters, transportation hub, An embarkation point for troops, it held strategic value. Yet it had not been subjected to the sustained firebombing inflicted on other cities. To Japanese planners, this suggested intent. Hiroshima appeared to be preserved for a conventional attack, one that could still be met by air defenses, limited though they were. Pilots stationed nearby absorbed this logic. They expected future raids to resemble what they had already endured: high-altitude bombers by day, incendiaries by night, each destructive but comprehensible. Their training, such as it remained, prepared them for repetition, not rupture. That expectation framed the morning of August 6th, when radar failed to register a large formation, when reports described only a handful of aircraft. No alarm spread through the system. There was no scramble at scale. No emergency interception plan triggered. To the men responsible for defending Japanese airspace, nothing suggested that the familiar structure of the air war was about to collapse entirely, and so the skies remained calm, right up until the moment Hiroshima ceased to fit any pattern they had ever been trained to recognize. Hiroshima's relative quiet through most of 1945 was not accidental. Within the logic of American strategic bombing, the city occupied a specific place. It was large enough to demonstrate effect, compact enough to measure results, and important enough that its destruction would register immediately within Japanese command channels. For Japanese planners, however, this same absence of damage fostered a dangerous assumption that Hiroshima's fate would unfold according to the same rules governing every other city. The city sat along the delta of the Oda River, spread across flat terrain with little natural cover. Army facilities, supply depots, and communication centers were woven directly into the urban fabric. Troop movements passed through its rail yards. From the air, it was an easily identifiable target. Yet because it had been spared mass incendiary attacks, Hiroshima became an internal reference point, a city still intact, still functioning, still defensible in theory. Reconnaissance flights over the region had reinforced this belief. Pilots reported no unusual enemy concentrations offshore. No carrier task forces loitered within range. High-altitude American aircraft occasionally passed overhead, but these were interpreted as weather reconnaissance or mapping missions. Common enough by mid-1940, Weinstein and mid-1945 that they no longer triggered panic. On the morning of August 6th, radar stations detected a small number of incoming aircraft at high altitude. The count was too low to justify a full-scale response. Japanese doctrine, shaped by months of large bomber formations, prioritized fuel conservation. Scrambling fighters against a handful of planes risked exhausting limited resources for minimal gain. Orders were issued to observe, not intercept. This decision, rational by every standard of the existing air war, sealed Hiroshima's fate. At 8:15 a.m., the detonation occurred. What followed immediately confused every reporting system Japan possessed. Initial ground communications ceased. Telephone lines went dead. Radio transmissions fragmented or stopped altogether. From neighboring regions, observers reported a blinding flash visible far beyond the expected radius of any known bomb, followed by a vertical cloud that expanded faster than firestorm columns seen over Tokyo or Osaka. Air reconnaissance was ordered within hours. Pilots approaching Hiroshima encountered air behavior they could not explain. Rising columns generated violent updrafts that buffeted aircraft hundreds of meters above the city. Smoke did not drift laterally as in conventional fires. It rose, folded inward, and spread into a broad, symmetrical mass. Below, the familiar grid of streets and rivers was obscured beneath a uniform layer of destruction. From altitude, the damage defied interpretation. There was no visible epicenter in the usual sense. No bomb craters, no patterns of progressive burn. Entire districts appeared flattened simultaneously. Fires burned without the staggered progression pilots associated with incendiary raids. Even hardened structures near the center had vanished or collapsed inward, leaving open ground where buildings had stood only hours earlier. Reconnaissance crews struggled to report what they were seeing. Terminology failed. Words like burned, bombed, or destroyed no longer captured the scale or speed of what had occurred. Some pilots described the city as having been compressed. Others noted that it looked as if a single force had pressed downward across everything at once. Within aviation command centers, the first tentative assessments avoided conclusions. Some officers suggested a new type of explosive, perhaps a massive conventional bomb. Others speculated about concentrated incendiaries delivered simultaneously. Yet even these explanations felt insufficient. No known delivery method could account for the instantaneous transformation reported from the air. Crucially, pilots understood what had not happened. There had been no air battle, no interception, no warning formation to engage. Japanese fighters had not failed to reach the bombers. They had been rendered irrelevant before the question even arose. As reports accumulated through the day, one reality became unavoidable. Hiroshima had not been defeated through the familiar mechanics of air war. It had been erased through a method that bypassed everything pilots had trained to confront. The sky itself had offered no opportunity to resist. By nightfall, the realization had begun to settle within Japan's aviation community. Whatever had destroyed Hiroshima did not challenge air defenses. It ignored them. And in that understanding lay a deeper fear, that if this weapon existed once, it could exist again, anywhere, without warning. That fear would crystallize in the days that followed. For Japanese pilots trained to read destruction from the air, Hiroshima presented a scene that refused interpretation. Reconnaissance crews approaching the city expected to map damage, identify fire spread, and estimate rebuilding timelines, tasks they had performed repeatedly over dozens of bombed cities. What they found instead was a visual absence of process. There was no gradient from light damage to heavy, no surviving industrial blocks marking the limits of the raid. The city appeared uniformly altered, as if the destruction had not moved across space, but arrived everywhere at once. From altitude, the Oda River's familiar branching channels were barely visible through the haze. Bridges had vanished or sagged into the water. The city center showed no vertical remnants that typically survived incendiary raids. Smoke continued to rise, but it lacked the chaotic turbulence pilots associated with firestorms. It moved with a strange coherence, fed by heat still lifting from ground that no longer resembled urban terrain. Veteran aviators, men who had flown over Manila, Shanghai, and the ruins of Tokyo, noted the difference immediately. Those cities burned outward, each raid leaving layers of damage that could be read like a timeline. Hiroshima offered no such narrative. Its destruction had no visible stages. It appeared final from the first glance. Equally disturbing was what the pilots understood about their own absence from the event. Japanese fighter units had not been overwhelmed. They had not been outmaneuvered or shot down. They had simply been unnecessary. The attacking aircraft had arrived unchallenged, released a single device, and departed. No air battle had taken place. No defense had even been tested. For pilots whose identity was bound to interception, climb rates, attack angles, gunnery solutions, this was a profound negation. The B-29 had already stretched the limits of Japanese air defense. Hiroshima confirmed that even those strained efforts no longer mattered. Speed, altitude, and numbers were irrelevant when a single aircraft could deliver decisive destruction without engagement. Within Air Defense Headquarters, reports from pilots intensified confusion rather than clarifying it. Damage assessments contradicted known models. Communications officers struggled to categorize the event. There was no code for a city destroyed in one moment. Orders stalled as commanders waited for more information that never resolved the core mystery. This paralysis reflected more than uncertainty. It marked the collapse of a shared framework. Japanese aviation doctrine had no language for what had occurred. Pilots could describe what they saw, but command could not translate those observations into strategy. The system designed to respond to air attack found itself without a problem it could define. As these three perspectives converged, visual incomprehension, defensive irrelevance, and doctrinal failure, the realization sharpened. Hiroshima was not an isolated anomaly. It was a message delivered through the air, one that bypassed combat entirely. And that message was only beginning to be understood. Japanese aviation doctrine had been shaped by decades of assumptions, that wars in the air were contests of reach and resistance, that aircraft existed to contest space, and that destruction unfolded through accumulation. Hiroshima invalidated each of these principles in a single moment. There was no accumulation to interrupt, no space to contest, no meaningful role left for interception or sacrifice. Pilots understood this before formal explanations arrived. Their training emphasized response, scramble times, climb profiles, attack vectors. Hiroshima had required none of these from the attacker and allowed none from the defender. The sky, once the final domain of resistance, had been bypassed entirely. In doctrinal terms, air power had ceased to be interactive. This realization cut deeper than the earlier acceptance of defeat against massed bombers. Firebombing had overwhelmed defenses through scale. Hiroshima did so through indifference. The weapon did not care how many fighters Japan could still launch. It did not provoke a battle. It concluded one. Among surviving veteran aviators, the psychological effect was immediate and severe. Many had reconciled themselves to dying in combat. Kamikaze operations, however grim, at least preserved a sense of agency. Hiroshima removed even that. There was no enemy to reach, no formation to penetrate, no moment of decision. Pilots reported a shift from fear to something colder. The destruction inspired neither rage nor resolve, but a hollow clarity. They recognized that personal skill, once the core of aviation identity, had lost its relevance. Survival or death would now be determined by forces far beyond the cockpit. This realization spread quietly. It did not need to be spoken aloud. The images seen from reconnaissance aircraft said enough. Men who had trained for years to master the sky understood that mastery no longer mattered. Within days, Japanese aviation intelligence reached an unavoidable conclusion. The United States had crossed a technological threshold. This was not simply a more powerful bomb. It represented a new category of warfare, one in which the traditional relationship between aircraft and target had been severed. Firebombing destroyed cities through persistence. This weapon erased them through certainty. For pilots, the distinction was decisive. Firebombing could be opposed, delayed, or complicated. Hiroshima could not. By the time reports from Hiroshima circulated fully through aviation channels, the meaning was clear. This was not a weapon meant to win air superiority. It made air superiority irrelevant. That understanding hung heavily over every airfield and command post as Japan waited, without confidence, without defense, to see whether Hiroshima was an ending or a beginning. The hours following August 6th blurred into a period of relentless reporting. Japanese aviation units across Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku awaited clarification that never came. Reconnaissance pilots returned from Hiroshima with accounts that resisted formal classification. Army Air Service analysts compared aerial photographs taken before and after the detonation, aligning river bends and coastline features to confirm what their eyes already told them. The city had not burned. It had been structurally erased. Medical units attached to air bases began receiving displaced personnel, and injured survivors evacuated from the outskirts. Their symptoms deepened the confusion. Many showed no visible wounds. Yet they deteriorated rapidly. Pilots accustomed to assessing blast trauma and burns reported unfamiliar patterns: sudden weakness, hair loss, internal bleeding. These reports reached Aviation Command through informal channels, bypassing official medical summaries that lagged behind reality. Within Air Defense Headquarters, senior officers convened emergency assessments. The possibility of a new explosive was no longer speculative. Analysts reviewed previous American scientific capabilities, recalling intelligence fragments about unconventional research. No existing bomb could account for the radius of destruction or the immediate incapacitation of survivors far from the center. Most unsettling was the operational implication. Hiroshima had been destroyed without triggering Japan's remaining defenses. Radar stations had functioned normally. Communication lines had followed protocol. Fighter units had obeyed fuel conservation orders. The system had done what it was designed to do, and it had still failed completely. For pilots, this was the decisive moment. They understood that their absence from the event was not due to error or delay. It was built into the nature of the attack. The weapon required no bombing run, no formation, no prolonged presence over the target. The entire logic of interception dissolved in retrospect. As August 7th progressed, reconnaissance sorties continued. Pilots, flying over the ruins, confirmed that the destruction was not spreading. There was no advancing fire line. The city was not continuing to burn outward. It had reached its final state within moments of detonation. This single fact carried enormous weight. It meant that warning, evacuation, and counterattack, core elements of air defense planning, had become meaningless. Messages filtered upward to the highest levels of command. Aviation officers struggled to brief civilian leaders on what could not be framed within existing doctrine. The air war, as Japan had known it, had ended without a final battle. Yet even as this realization took hold, uncertainty remained. Some commanders clung to the hope that Hiroshima was unique, a prototype, a one-time demonstration. Pilots, however, were less optimistic. They had seen the simplicity of the delivery. One aircraft, one release, one city gone. If it had happened once, they knew it could happen again. That knowledge hovered over every remaining airfield as Japan waited for confirmation that would arrive sooner than anyone expected. On August 9, 1945, the uncertainty ended. That morning, Aviation Command received fragmented reports from Kyushu. Radar detections again showed a small number of high-altitude aircraft approaching Japanese airspace. Once more, the formation was judged insufficient to justify a large-scale interception. Fuel remained scarce. Fighters were held back. The logic of conservation prevailed, exactly as it had 3 days earlier. Shortly after 11 o'clock a.m., Nagasaki disappeared. Initial reports mirrored those from Hiroshima. Communications ceased abruptly. Observers described a flash visible from distant coastlines. A towering cloud rose above the city, distinct in shape and behavior from anything associated with incendiary raids. Within hours, reconnaissance flights confirmed what aviation officers feared most. This was not a singular event. It was a repeatable process. For Japanese pilots, Nagasaki provided the final proof. Hiroshima had shattered doctrine. Nagasaki shattered hope. Reconnaissance crews approaching the city encountered the same atmospheric anomalies: violent updrafts, unstable air, an overwhelming sense of scale. Once again, the destruction showed no progression. Entire districts were flattened in an instant. Fires burned, but they were secondary, almost incidental, to the underlying devastation. This second detonation erased any remaining belief that air defense could adapt. 2 cities, destroyed in the same manner, by the same method, without interception or warning. The implications were unambiguous. The United States possessed a weapon that rendered Japan's remaining air forces strategically obsolete. Within aviation circles, conversations shifted rapidly. Discussions of tactics ceased. Planning documents became irrelevant overnight. Pilots were grounded not by lack of aircraft, but by lack of purpose. There was nothing left for them to stop. Reports delivered to senior command framed the situation with stark clarity. The weapon required no mass deployment. It did not depend on air superiority campaigns. It bypassed the entire structure of aerial warfare Japan had built its resistance upon. For many pilots, this was the moment their war ended, days before the formal announcement of surrender. The realization did not come with panic or protest. It arrived quietly, carried by photographs, reconnaissance notes, and the shared understanding of professionals who recognized a fundamental shift when they saw one. The sky, which had once been contested inch by inch through years of sacrifice, had ceased to matter. As Japan's leadership confronted the broader political consequences, aviation units absorbed a narrower, more personal truth. The age in which pilots could influence the fate of cities through skill and courage had passed. War had moved beyond the cockpit. That realization set the stage for the final collapse, not of Japan's will alone, but of an entire way of fighting. In the days following Nagasaki, Japan's aviation units entered a state of suspended existence. Aircraft remained on airfields. Maintenance crews continued their routines. Orders were issued and logged. Yet the purpose that had animated these systems was gone. Pilots understood that the war had crossed a threshold where their presence in the air no longer altered outcomes. Interception plans were quietly abandoned. Fuel allocations meant for emergency scrambles went unused. Some units received instructions to conserve aircraft for an invasion that now seemed unlikely to occur in the way previously envisioned. Others were told simply to stand by. The silence of command carried its own meaning. Morale reports reflected a distinct shift from despair to resignation. Earlier phases of the war had produced anger, defiance, and a willingness to sacrifice. Now, the dominant emotion among pilots was clarity. They had seen, through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that resistance in the air could no longer shape events. This was not defeat by exhaustion, but by irrelevance. Briefings to senior leadership incorporated aviation assessments that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Officers stated plainly that no air defense, regardless of reorganization, could prevent further destruction if the enemy chose to continue. This was not an admission of weakness. It was an acknowledgement of physics. The weapon's effects occurred too quickly, too completely, for response. Within the Imperial headquarters, these reports reinforced a growing consensus. The military situation could no longer be evaluated solely in terms of force balance or territorial loss. The existence of a weapon capable of annihilating cities without warning altered the meaning of continued resistance. Pilots stationed near Hiroshima and Nagasaki were among the first to internalize this reality. Some had flown reconnaissance over both cities. Their testimony carried weight precisely because it avoided exaggeration. They described what they saw with professional restraint: flattened terrain, absent structures, lingering radiation effects that defied medical understanding. For younger pilots, the aftermath was marked by confusion. They had trained for missions they would never fly. Aircraft prepared for interception or special attack now sat idle. The war they had been raised to fight had ended in a way no instructor had prepared them for. As days passed, the focus of aviation units shifted from combat readiness to documentation. Reports were compiled, photographs cataloged, observations preserved, for a future that was suddenly approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. The sky remained empty, not because the enemy had withdrawn, but because flight itself had lost its strategic meaning. That realization would shape the final decisions yet to come. As August progressed, the implications of Hiroshima and Nagasaki moved from aviation circles into the core of Japan's national decision-making. The air war, once the arena in which Japan had hoped to impose cost and delay, was no longer a factor. Reports from pilots and commanders made clear that even the total commitment of remaining aircraft could not influence what came next. When the emperor was briefed on the situation, assessments included aviation analyses alongside diplomatic and military considerations. The inability to defend the nation's cities from further attacks weighed heavily. Unlike previous bombing campaigns, there was no expectation of adaptation, no countermeasure under development, no tactic waiting to be tested. The weapon had ended the conversation before it began. For pilots, the formal announcement of surrender on August 15th confirmed what they already knew. The war in the air had concluded days earlier. Aircraft that had once symbolized resistance were grounded permanently. Some were dismantled, others were destroyed to prevent capture. Many simply remained where they stood, relics of a conflict overtaken by technology. In post-war years, Japanese aviators reflected on those final days with notable consistency. They did not describe shock at defeat. That had come earlier. What lingered was the moment of realization that the skills they had devoted their lives to mastering had been eclipsed. The cockpit, once the decisive vantage point of modern war, had become observational rather than influential. These reflections influenced post-war aviation thought far beyond Japan. Military planners around the world recognized what Japanese pilots had grasped immediately. The nature of air power had changed. Aircraft were no longer solely instruments of battle. They had become delivery platforms for forces that rendered traditional defense obsolete. Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. For pilots who had lived through that transition in real time, the shift was not abstract. It was measured in empty skies, grounded aircraft, and the quiet certainty that war had moved beyond their reach. As Japan emerged from surrender into occupation, its aviation legacy closed not with a final engagement, but with a recognition. The sky, once contested, had become a corridor. What remained was to understand what that transformation meant, not just for Japan but for humanity. For Japanese pilots, the end of the war did not arrive with surrender documents or radio broadcasts. It arrived earlier, in the air above Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when they looked down and saw cities that no longer obeyed the rules of war. They had spent their lives learning. They understood something fundamental before most of the world did. Warfare had crossed a boundary where skill, bravery, and even mass no longer guaranteed relevance. The cockpit, once a place of decision, had become a place of observation. Victory and defeat were no longer determined in minutes of combat, but in moments of release. This realization carried a quiet finality. There was no anger in it. No sense of betrayal. Only recognition. The age of aerial duels, interception doctrine, and contested skies had given way to an era in which destruction could arrive without engagement, without warning, without resistance. Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not simply end a war. They redefined what war could become. Japanese pilots, trained to fight enemies they could see, were among the first to confront a future where the most decisive forces were invisible, instantaneous, and beyond interception. Their experience stands as a sober reminder. Technology does not merely change how wars are fought, it determines whether fighting itself still has meaning. And on those clear August mornings in 1945, the men who flew beneath the rising clouds understood that the sky had ceased to be a battlefield and had become something far more dangerous,